Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. We're here to debate, have a public debate as a start for a multi-day conference on hegemonies and alliances with the focus on Syria. I'm Dr. Walter Posch. I am privileged to welcome you in the name of Gertrud Auer and the Kreisky Forum and in the name of my institution, the National Defense College of Vienna. It was planned when in the uprun of this conference that I would share with you some thoughts very shortly on the frame of, on the intellectual and the political frame of this evening today. But events have overtaken our agenda. Our dear friend and a brother for many in this room, Jamal Khashoggi's whereabouts are unknown. I will not go into speculations of what would or did not happen. And I'm asking myself, and I think a lot of us ask the same thing, what does this mean for us and also for this conference? First, it means a certain resilience and persistence, obviously, of the security state, an entity totally void of ideology, serving basically only a clique, where, and Middle Easterners know this very well, disappearances, even political murder, is widespread and rather the standard than the exception. We're afraid that a similar fate might have happened to our friend. This resilience seems to augur very badly for the future of any peaceful resolution of current conflicts. It comes with high brutality and seems to survive crisis even if states and whole nations break down. A second point it tells us also for this conference is a certain kind or a very typical hypocrisy of the political West or Western political elites. It's true, we don't know what happened, but there were events where less proof has been, where much more serious and much more radical political action has been taken. I'm afraid Middle Easterners from all political spectra will interpret this fact as another example of Western hypocrisy. When something happens in Europe or to Europeans, it's more valuable and more debatable and triggers more serious action than when it happens in the Middle East to Middle Easterners. In the end, it also caters to our bigger theme, that is hegemonies and alliances. There is clearly no hegemon. Both countries involved in this affair are allies in a way, and they are allies of the West. So what does it mean to be in an alliance or not to be in an alliance? Who is friend, who is enemy? And this, I think, is also leading to the problem of this evening. I hand over now to our co-organizers, because one thing is also clear, that big conferences can only be conducted and organized with international and national partners. To Hannes Swoboda from the Peace Institute and to a good friend of Jamal Khashoggi's, Taha Özhan from the Sharq Forum. Mr. Swoboda.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the International Institute for Peace in Vienna, I want to welcome you as well. I want to thank Walter Posch for all his energy and the knowledge he put and know-how he put into the organization, and especially, of course, to Gertrud, that we could again cooperate in organizing this event tonight and the discussions we will have in the coming days. As Walter mentioned already, of course, what happened or what seemed to happen in the last days in Istanbul is perhaps a symbol of the very complex and contradictory situation we have in the region. And we still have wars in the region, in Syria and in Yemen, for example, and even if we can look forward and hope for peace, it's probably true what I think it was President Macron said, you can win the war, but you didn't win the peace. And that will be true for, I think, many years to come. Unfortunately, that even if, let's say, the regime in Syria had been or will win the war, it will not be peace, at least for some time being. And the same you can say about the situation in Yemen. So we have to look forward to a very fragile, contradictory situation in that region. But it's not, to look it from the outside, because Europe is in many ways involved. Recent reports on the armament supply to many of the countries are very devastating in a way. And if a country like Spain tried to do something about it, was immediately pushed back and was reminded on many contracts they will have to lose if they would stop some armament supplies it's promised to have. And of course, especially the refugee issue is an issue which is in a way will go on in affecting us, and the question of the return for refugees, for example, to Syria, is an enormous task where we don't know how it can come. And of course, it's a big humanitarian issue for the refugees themselves, and of course for our internal debates we have in Europe, including in Austria. So there are many other issues, and I want to be too long. I think I want to especially thank Gudrun and all the speakers here on the podium that they were ready to come and to discuss with us, and I wish you success. And I think let's still hope that there is some line of optimism on the Khashoggi affair, but at least let's think that peace is still at stake, and we should never forget and never leave out to fight for peace in that very close region to Europe. Successful success, and good luck, at least for our work tonight. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Volker, for the introduction. Unfortunately, today, my colleague and friend, Wadah Khanfar, was supposed to be here, but he is dealing with our friend's commemoration. Jamal Khashoggi was a close, humble friend, a smiling soul, and courage-conscious, a critical thinker. He literally didn't allow the phrase Saudi journalist to become an oxymoron. And he paid a huge price. He has been killed by Saudi hit squad in Saudi soil, in Saudi consulate in Istanbul, in an ISIS-style barbaric way. This is not even a debate in Turkey right now. The simple evidence is he went in, and unfortunately, we didn't see him again. This is telling too many things, actually. This is in parallel with what kind of geopolitical ecosystem and climate that we are getting through or we are living in lately. It has an axis, actually. One side goes to Washington, another leg in Europe, and maybe European Middle Eastern axis again. This new crown prince, his name is usually abbreviated as MBS, and when I see his name, definitely I see somewhere in the sentence IPO, and sometimes I'm confused. I mean, are we talking about an IPO or real man? But looks like his initial public offering yielded a crime, and our dear friend was the victim. The title of the conference, which we have been following in this forum for a couple of years, is an important one, Hegemonies and Alliances. And Jamal was at the middle of this important title. He paid a huge price. We are very sorry. And we don't know what will happen after his sacrifice. Because right now, many places in the world can easily turn into be a crime scene if this rogue mentality keeps going. I hope this will start moving at least serious actors rethinking about easy solutions, shortcuts, especially in the Middle East and the crisis areas, and come on to real serious visionary geopolitics where we can find more collaboration rather than unilateralism or bilateralism, and go back to at least some common grounds to get out of this vicious and terrible bloody cycle. Thank you very much, and I hope we will be having a wonderful meeting today and the coming days, although we have a big loss, but I pray for his soul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taha, Walter, and Hannes, for your introduction. It's not easy to start with a normal discussion, but we will do it, and we will, without further ado, go into it, because we are a big panel and we don't have much time. And I make a short introduction of the speakers in the order of the program. I mean, it's needless to say that all are Middle East and North Africa specialists, otherwise they would not be here. This is clear. So I start with Joost Hiltermann. He's a Middle East, North Africa program director of the International Crisis Group, which means that he's leading the organization's research, analysis, policy prescription, and advocacy in and about the region. Laipson, I have to say, I think you know all of them already. All of them have been here in the Kreisky Forum. She's the director of the International Security Program at the Shahvar School, I hope I pronounce it correctly, of Government and Public Policy at George Mason University. And she joined George Mason University after a long career in government and as president and CEO of the Stimson Center. Then Vladimir Sazhin, he's senior researcher at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and he worked at almost all institutions there, and he taught in the University of Moscow, great specialist for Iran, Afghanistan, or whatever. Soli, here is Soli. Soli Shahvar, he's director at the Esri Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Haifa. And I think you are doing that job for quite a long time, more than 10 years now, and you were deputy director before. And Nicola Pedde, whom we know very well also. He's director of the Institute for Global Studies in Rome and the editor of Geopolitics of the Middle East, a journal of the Institute, and La Sapienza University in Rome. So please, Joost, you are the first to take the floor.
Thank you, Gudrun, and good evening, everyone. I wanted to thank Taha in particular for the words he said about a person that most of us know, we're friends with, and deeply appreciate as a colleague, and now after what looks like his crude and brazen murder by the Saudi government. But I was asked to talk about Syria and about the notion of resilience and escalation. And so I want to very briefly give you three examples of resilience and one of escalation, or potential escalation. The first example of resilience, the force in Syria that has shown the greatest resilience, is the regime. The regime has survived. The regime has essentially won the war, though not necessarily the peace. It still has to recover territory that it lost to rebels, but it looks set to do so. The regime has proven to be strong enough to survive the assault for 7 years from popular groups, rebel groups, jihadist groups, supported by outside countries and armed by outside countries. Of course, the regime itself received outside help and significantly more outside help and was able to prevail that way. But it survived, and that is something, and we'll have to see how far that goes, whether it will survive the peace, whether it can impose a peace. But for now, the regime has proven to be particularly resilient. It is also weak enough that its allies cannot abandon it. And that also helps to explain its resilience. What may prove to be resilient is the Syrian diaspora, because a good segment of Syrian society, including an important part of the educated elites, are currently living in exile. And given time, may prove to be a potent force against whoever rules Damascus in the future. We'll have to see how that plays itself out. If we make a historical comparison and look at Iraq, for example, before 2003, we see that the diaspora, the Iraqi diaspora, had a lot of potential, but wasn't in any way unified, in part because the Iraqi regime had long hands or long arms, and did the kind of thing that we've just seen happen to Jamal Khashoggi. This was quite common, a common practice by the Iraqi regime. But all the same, many people, Jamal was of course a journalist and had strong views which he expressed, good views by the way. But many people in the diaspora are just there to live and to have professional careers. But one day they may be called upon to come back and to rebuild Syria, just as Iraqi exiles contributed to the rebuilding of Iraq, of course. Iraqis who stayed put on the ground in Iraq also contributed to it, and so I think also many Syrians currently still in Syria will play that role in the future. So there's resilience there as well. The third group is the group that controls one area that is still not under government control, and that is the Kurdish areas and the military group called the YPG, which is the Syrian affiliate of the PKK in Turkey. And that group has survived so far, and in fact done very well, in part because of external help. The United States has armed and trained it, but also because it is a very opaque organization. You don't know what they are doing, what their command structure looks like, who gives the orders, where do they go, and that provides it a certain immunity to attack and even criticism. So that's a third example. Finally, in the category of escalation, I would say the potential escalation could come from the non-winners of the external powers in this war, meaning not Russia and Iran, and not Turkey, but the United States, and maybe European powers to some extent, with whatever leverage they have, be it financial or military or otherwise. But they could be powerful spoilers in any attempt by the winners to not only win the war but also win the peace. And so if there's not going to be a peace, it is because the regime is not strong enough to impose it, and the spoiling forces, which are the Western powers, are strong enough to prevent it. And so I think we will see, for that reason, still a long period of instability in Syria.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you, Gudrun. And I'm very happy to be back, even though I think our conversations will be quite sober and tempered by all of our shock at a personal level at what has happened to Jamal Khashoggi. I should just say I'm going to bring a Washington perspective. I just got off the plane 2 hours ago from Washington, and this should not be construed as in any way representing the Trump administration, but trying to, if I can, illuminate and clarify some of the recent changes in U.S. policy. So I want to also pick up on the themes of resilience and escalation through a prism of how the United States is acting with a very weak hand in Syria. So I think first point that has to be made is that the U.S. is more or less on the losing side in Syria, but still trying to find a productive role to play. And I think it's quite striking in the recent meetings at the UN for the annual gathering at the UN General Assembly, more clarity about a genuine shift in American policy. So prior to this year, the Trump administration was only looking to get out of Syria. Once the war against the defeat of the Islamic State was over, I think the president had every intention of pulling American troops out and saying this is a problem that our Russian friends or others can take the lead on. But now we see that they're looking at the ongoing tragedy and crisis of Syria through the perspective of their Iran policy. So there is now a totally new rationale that the United States will stay in Syria, principally troops in the northeast part of the country, no longer with the counterterrorism rationale, but now with the rationale of putting pressure on Iran, Syria, and Russia to make a condition of change in Syria to be the removal of the Iranian presence. So basically saying, we'll leave when the Iranians leave. That's essentially the proposition right now. A second point, and so I quite agree with Joost that this has a great danger for escalation, that the United States is now creating an additional layer of tension to an already very complicated situation. And while I don't believe President Trump sees this as a direct U.S.-Iran military conflict, I think he does believe that there's a psychological and political pressure from American presence that, in theory, and I think unrealistically, would somehow make the Iranians recalculate their own interests in Syria. I don't think he will succeed, but I think that is the logic of the American position right now. It's also useful to understand who's now in charge of Syria policy. So the administration persuaded a former American diplomat, Jim Jeffrey. Jim had been the ambassador to Turkey and the ambassador to Iraq. He is also a former Army officer who served in Vietnam and very much believes that the American military plays a role in diplomacy. Not the deployment of American troops around the world is not just to fight, it's also part of a diplomatic engagement. So I think Jim looks at this, I would think he favors the American continued presence in Syria, although when he was out of government, he argued that the American ground forces should leave Syria because they were only playing a supporting role and they were, in a way, vulnerable and not very useful. But he did support American air power as part of the equation to both defeat the Islamic State and to keep pressure on the Assad regime. So I think all of these things suggest a shift to a slightly more active American role, but still I think the administration defers to Russia, Turkey, and other in the UN, if they can come up with some formula that will move things in a more productive direction, with the assumption, as Joost has laid out, that the war is essentially winding down. But I think that American interests essentially reside in three parts of Syria: the northeast, where to keep the Islamic State from re-emerging in any kind of a meaningful way; the Idlib area, where Turkey is really the agent of Western and opposition interests, trying to make sure that there's not a bloodbath there. Recently succeeded in arranging for a pullback of armed presence so that perhaps the regime would reassert control in Idlib province without a huge amount of violence. And the third area is, of course, the Israeli interest, the Israeli-Iranian tensions in southern Syria, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. I am not sure that the United States and Israel have exactly the same expectations or requirements for what they would like to see in terms of a change in Iranian policy, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit later. But my only point on resilience would be a little bit to complement what Joost has said. I think if we look at the role that the United Nations has played, and certainly American aid in support of many international NGOs, there's remarkable resilience in pockets of Syrian society. We do see small towns. There's a micro-level resilience that the international community has tried to support and keep alive. It doesn't solve the larger political problem, but it does demonstrate that there is a human spirit, there is still a desire by Syrians to retake their communities, to behave in ways that are not politically cruel, in managing their own communities and local resources. So there's a quiet micro story going on in parts of Syria that I think is sometimes missed when we look at the strategic story, which is that the war has ended and the bad guys won.
Vladimir. Thank you.
Use the micro, or I give you my, it's okay?
Yes. Thank you very much. The situation in Syria is very, very difficult. And I must say that now the situation is changing. I say that ISIS or Daesh almost has been destroyed. And now the main power work in Syria to find the ground for the Syrian future. But I am not sure that this power, I mean the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, can build the good road to the good future of Syria. Because I think they play in Syria now when I said ISIS destroyed, only for their selfish interests. And you know that's there is no common opinion between these four powers, and I think that the future of Syria is not brilliant, and I think that the state Syrian state we had before 2011 now doesn't exist and will not exist in the future. I think that this state will collapse into four parts. And we can see this idea now. You know that eastern part from the river, it's American and Kurds part, and they declared, Kurds declared some days ago that that there will be a government which manage this region. And Mr. Bolton even said that we must unite the western part of Iraq and the eastern part of Syria and make the new state. It seems to me it's the name of this state, Sunnistan. And what's about Russia? Certainly, Russia has its interest in Syria, and I can't say that this interest concentrate, focus only in support of regime of Bashar Assad. I don't think so. I think that the Kremlin insists in that the future government of in Damascus, we will not say in Syria, but in Damascus, must understand the interests of Russia in this country and in the Middle East at all, and certainly support the idea of these two military bases. I mean, Air Force bases and Navy bases. And I think that in future Russia tried to build this pro-Russian zone in this western part of Syria in near the Mediterranean zone. It's the second zone. The third zone certainly is Idlib and near this province. I mean the zone which now under control of Turkey and will be under control of Turkey many years in the future. And another part of this country is the Iranian and Assad or his friends, and that's the fourth part of Syria in the future. It's my idea. I must say that I express my own opinion. It's not opinion of my institute. It's not opinion certainly on Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, and certainly it's not opinion of the Kremlin. You know, maybe I mistake, but I think so that in the future we will not see the state of Syria in these borders which were before 2011. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, sorry, I think.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be here. This is my first time. I hope not the last one, but let's see. I do agree with some of the point that my Russian colleague here approved. I see more the chances of conflict in the area. And in saying so, I think the thread that have to be taken into consideration is the Iranian intentions, the Iranian long-term intentions, and the process and the systematic way that the Iranians operate in whenever they get a foothold. This happened in Lebanon, and you know under whose authority Lebanon is today, since 1982 that started Hezbollah, and actually yesterday I read that they are working now on Afghan Hezbollah in Afghanistan. The way it doesn't end with presence of Iranian forces here and there. The Iranian is much more systematic. They establish cultural centers. They establish Hosseiniya, which is centers of religious of the Shia, mainly to commemorate the death or martyrdom of Hussein, the Imam Hussein, the third Shiite Imam. They do a lot of processes in the streets. They put banners, they put the murals of the Khamenei, Nasrallah, people like that. They buy property and in the area they control. Actually, what we know that in Syria happens is that they settle Shiites from other countries, mainly Afghan, Pakistani Shiites, that they are actually part of the militias they hold in Syria. They are encouraging Hezbollah fighters to move with their families into Syria. As you know, Syria is there are different estimates about the population of Syria. I read between 18 to 24 million, that's the estimates. But what we know is about 6 million Syrians are refugees out of the country, and 6 million are refugees within the country. It means they relocated within Syria, most of whom, of course, are Sunnis. Now, in April this year, the Syrian government drew a new law, property law. And the property law actually says that you have to prove your possession of the land or of the property with official documents. Now imagine the Syria that we know in the news. Everything is destructed, many people fled. Who is going now to find his document? And we know that those who do find documents and present them, they are bullied by the authorities. So this is a very systematic work that the Iranians do, and they haven't been, according to Iranian official figures published 2-3 days ago, they have put about $16 billion into Syria. Now, I think the figure is higher, but no country puts $16 billion in a country just to come and aid Bashar Assad and go out. So the Iranians are to stay, that's for sure. Now, how you can, where the Israeli or the other governments involved are going to do with this Iranian far-sighted or a long-term program, that's a problem. I don't think that Israel will be able, with whatever it has, to be eradicating Iranian presence in Syria. There's no way. They can damage the Iranian position, and I think the Iranians take it after I think it was April 2018, when the Iranian fired 32 missiles, 4 of which was actually reached Israel and it was destroyed, but the others fell in Syrian territory. But after that, they got such a blow that the Iranians have decided, I think, in the higher hierarchy of the Iranian regime, not to engage in direct military operation with the Israelis. And they think, I think that they have taken into consideration that out of the 100% shipments and sites that they want to establish, maybe 30, 40, 50%, 60% will be demolished, but 40% will remain. And if you look what happened in 2006, in the Israeli-Lebanon, what is called the second Israeli-Hezbollah war, or Israel-Lebanon war, what happened that whatever was destroyed by Hezbollah, today Hezbollah has also twice, if not thrice, more than what it has before. What does it mean? It means that they have the supply chain. And this will continue. It means that the Iranian won't give up. Won't give up unless we see a major force, mainly Russia. Of course, Russia has its own interests, as Sazhin said, and it's not going correlating or parallel to the Iranian interest. The Russians needed the Iranians in order to fight ISIS, which practically the Iranians didn't much fight. It was more the Kurds that bore the burden of fighting ISIS, but okay, they helped as well. So we see two powers, actually, Russia and Iran, that they have their own interest in Syria. I think Russia, from the experience of Afghanistan, is not going to bring a lot of Russian soldiers or maintain Russian soldiers in Syria for a long period, because otherwise it will be I think, from its own experience, from the Israeli experience in Lebanon, it will be a stupid thing to hold foreign forces on a foreign territory. So therefore, there is a lot of complexity. Of course, Turkey was mentioned, and all those the Assad regime, and I think the Iranians don't look at the Assad regime, they look much beyond the Assad regime, according to what they are doing in Syria. Actually, one thing I failed to mention until now is that they, everywhere they actually work and they maintain, they try to advance the policy that is called Shiaization of the population. It means they're not only bringing Shiites outside of Syria, but they are trying to actually Shi'ayas, to make the convert to Shiism of the local Sunni population. They have done, they have even established the Liwa al-Baghir in eastern, in Dir az-Zur area from Sunni tribes. How they do it? There's a range of issues that make youngsters, Sunni youngsters, to join. Some of them, they don't want to go to the Syrian army, to be recruited within the Syrian army. They prefer to get good salary from the Iranians and not to serve. Other things is that, of course, the material issue that, you know, in a country that is devastated and there is high unemployment, there is a possibility. Also, the Iranians know how to, they set up schools in those areas. Persian schools, according to the Ministry of Iran's education program, which they study Persian, they get Shi'i lessons, and in academic level, students are sent to Iran free of charge to study in Iran, of course, and to be in an environment that they can be influenced. So their program and their policy is far-sighted, and I don't think that anyone can eradicate this unless something major steps are taken, and this is with the international, I would say, arena that we can see today, mainly on JCPOA, disagreement between United States and Europe, and United States, we are talking maybe 2 to 6 years period, because after Trump, who knows what will happen. Whether, I don't think it will be further escalated. It will probably be more moderate president will come in, maybe not Obama policy, but all these issue, I think it indicates that the territory that the area is going to be, and Syria, if you are focusing on Syria, going to be very unstable for a long period of time. And that's my forecast, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicola.
Thank you very much, and again, let me thank you for the Kreisky Foundation for the invitation, Walter Posch for the invitation, and the touching words remembering Khashoggi. I really appreciate it. Well, in my few minutes, and considering resilience and escalation factors, well, first of all, what I can see from my point of view is that there is a growing deficit of resilience among all the actors involved. The conflict have not benefited any of them. Yes, I agree with Joost, the government/regime, that's the issue of the narrative, and the language has certainly benefited. They have won the war, they have consolidated their power, but it's difficult to say that they are in a position to survive without the others. They are in a position to survive without a long-term strategy, which it's extremely difficult to imagine in this phase, especially within the roster of the forces which are fighting or competing on the ground. So yes, they have won in a certain sense, but this victory could be extremely risky. All actors have been dramatically weakened by the conflict, and not only in economic terms, but also in terms of numbers of fighters, soldiers able to be deployed on the ground. There are actors which has paid a price which is probably unsustainable in comparison with the long-term challenges that they're facing. In particular, I think that Hezbollah played a major role in a certain part of Syria, and the capacity brought on the ground and the number of losses that they suffered is posing a question for the future of the capability of the group to sustain certain kind of conflict, certain kind of operation abroad and inside Lebanon. I think that the paradoxes of the Syrian crisis also undermine the credibility of all the actors involved in the Syrian war, and it's even difficult to mention who is fighting who in this phase in Syria. There are different conflicts coexisting on the ground. Someone is chasing the Iranians, someone is chasing Daesh, someone is chasing the Russians, and so on and so forth. So the complexity of these conflicts, even in terms of objectives, I think it's evident, and it's in itself it's posing a huge threat in terms of solutions. How can we propose a solution? How can we find a solution if we are, in a sense, assisting to a combination of conflicts on the ground which are going in different directions with totally different targets and objectives? And so for those who are blaming the international community, Europe in particular, we have also to consider the European position toward the Syrian crisis. It's extremely difficult, I think, for Europe to identify a specific line of conduct, a specific line of actions in this crisis, because of the paradoxes we are facing on the ground, because of the complexity of these paradoxes, and because of the fact that most of these actors are trying to drag Europe into one of the many camps which are characterizing the battlefront. So in a certain sense, resilience is becoming erosion of forces, erosion of economic capacity, erosion of social sustainability, and none of the actors, not even one of the actors involved in the conflicts can sustain the conflict indefinitely. Nor Russia, nor the government in Syria, nor Iran, nor Hezbollah, nor the jihadists, nor the opposition forces. No one of them has the capacity of sustaining it indefinitely. And this is, of course, provoking the certain kind of developments, like the Sochi conference clearly presented in terms of solutions, or at least temporary solutions in order to find possible short-term alternatives which could help let's say defining practical solution in order at least to avoid other civilian massacres, other elements of violence which could interest the civilian population of Syria. Potential for further escalation. Well, the first is the legacy of the conflict, what it will happen in the future. Bashar al-Assad won the war in this phase, but what will happen to Bashar al-Assad the day after the final victory? So which kind of credibility he could have also in Syria, which kind of capacity he could express also in Syria, and which kind of support he will be able to get out of this conflict. Frankly speaking, I don't see an Iranian long-term plan to conquer the region. I see a chaotic situation which is involving all the actors with different interests. Each of them has his own perspective, has his own reason or supposed reason to be there and to participate in these conflicts. And the narrative seen from the various sides of the front, it's extremely heterogeneous. And this is characterizing most of the conflicts of the region. The potential of the Syrian crisis, it's in my opinion that of, in terms of further escalation, is that of expanding its negative and dangerous potential even after the end of the phase of conflict, when there will be the need of restoring the territorial integrity, and where the legacy of the conflicts, in my opinion, will emerge with all its dramatic consequence and with the burden of almost a decade of conflicts on the ground. This is what I fear, and I fear that there will be a scarce capacity from the regional and international actors to provide credible solution, economic sustain to the country, and so practical capability to restore a certain kind of stability on the ground.
Well, thank you so much. Of course, we have been longer than predicted, but I would not have missed one sentence I heard here. I mean, all of you agree there is more escalation potential than resilience. I'm very grateful to Ellen that she also mentioned this micro level resilience, because it gives at least hope to some people in this really tortured country. And I was thinking your points of resilience, like the Kurds in the east, and all of this also contain of course escalation potentials, like for example Kurds against Arabs in that region. I mean, we are always speaking about the east almost Kurdish area. But there are potential conflicts. Or also, it's interesting, we did not talk much about Turkey, I notice, on this panel. No? And I mean, this is a huge potential for conflict, if ever. I mean, there must be a minimum agreement between Damascus and the Turks, if there should be some future. But I want to ask if there are any immediate reactions. Okay. Please try to be short, because otherwise we don't give enough time to our audience.
Okay, can I?
Yes,
yeah,
of course.
Three points. So one on the resilience issue. I think Vladimir said something about that he didn't expect the borders to survive of Syria. So here we depart. Apart ways, rather. And so I think that if we look at resilience, two things that have proven to be particularly resilient are the borders and identities. And the borders have withstood the onslaught from both the Islamic State and the Kurds, especially the Iraqi-Syrian border, but also the border between Syria and Turkey. If we talk about, and Bolton can say whatever he wants, but when he talks about unifying Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, that is fanciful. That will never happen, because people on both sides don't want to be unified. So, and you can say there's Kurds on one side and Kurds on the other side, but there are Kurds who are under leaderships who are, bigger enemies than the Kurds in Syria are enemies of Damascus. So I don't see that happening at all. First point. Second point, you mentioned, Soli, the Iranian strategy. I wish you had also spoken about Israeli strategy, which I'm sure is an area of your expertise. On the Iranian side, I think you're right that Iran has a strategy, a long-term strategy. No doubt about it. Iran is an old power that it only works with long-term strategies. But that said, the evidence of Shiaization is very weak. And there are examples of it, but this is not a general pattern. Very few Shias are being settled. You may find some examples of education and this and that, but the main thing is that the Syrian people don't want this. And if you ask an average Syrian about who they like, then they will say, we like the Russians. I mean, this is in government-controlled areas. And they don't like the Iranians. Why? Because the Syrians are secular. And they really don't want the proselytizing Shia to come in when there is no Shia population to start with in Syria. So, there may be an attempt, but the traction simply isn't there. And finally, on the micro-resilience, I also think I'm going to disagree with you, even though it exists. And I've seen it, of course, we see it in front of our eyes. But we've also seen that in areas retaken by the regime, it's been wiped away. And so where it continues to survive is in Idlib, and it is in the YPG-controlled areas. But Idlib, we're in a holding pattern now, thanks to the agreement. But I see that going back to the regime sooner or later with Russian help and Iranian help, and the YPG-controlled areas. We'll have to see if there's a deal between the YPG and Damascus, brokered by Russia. If the Americans withdraw, which is, of course, a big if at this point, as you said. But I don't see that surviving, unfortunately. But until now, yes, there has been remarkable resilience at that level, and we could only wish that it would lead to some kind of self-rule under a future order in Syria. But as long as this regime is in place, it will not permit it. No.
Do you agree that, okay, please short.
Yes.
Because, you will not resolve your issue.
No intention. If I resolve this, I can have
yeah, we are.
10 Nobel Prizes I want.
Prize, yeah.
First of all, I didn't mean Shiization as the main thing. I said there is a series of issues that the Iranian, or tactics that the Iranian follow, and they do this almost everywhere. We have examples even in Latin America that they tried to Shiize even Indians in Central America. It doesn't mean that they succeed. But in this area, of course, the Alawites are kind of Shiites, but also, as I said before, they're moving in Shia family from outside of Syria into Syria. And this is a process. It not starts from today to tomorrow. The other thing is that I think we can say, I agree with you, Joost, that you said that the borders would remain, but I think within Syria there will be probably cantons or kind of confederation that might stable the area, this area, whether by religious or ethnic kind of the same thing that more or less happening in Iraq, although not officially, the confederation that we have. We have to understand that these are non-democratic states, and they are actually totalitarian. The violence is a big thing, and I don't think we can disregard now the Syrian opposition army or all these opposition. They probably move to guerrilla fighting or other thing, and we will see this. We see this all over Middle East in different parts. So this goes back to my vision or forecast that the country won't quiet down, won't rest.
Please, Michael.
Excuse me, I'll be very, very brief.
Well,
I don't agree.
About this,
I don't agree with my Israeli or Iranian friend.
Okay.
I think that
you should explain what you mean Israeli-Iranian. I was born in Iran and live in Israel. Okay.
It seems to me that the interests Russia and Iran in Syria are very, very different. We know that the main
that they are different.
Yes, the main purpose of Iran in this country to build the chain from Iran, Shia chain from Iran through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And, even Iranian authorities absolutely officially say that the part of this chain, Syrian part, is gold part. Because of it, they are not able to leave this country at all. And the purpose of Russia in this country, I think so, it's my opinion. The Soviet Union had a powerful position in the Middle East at all. And after destroy of the Soviet Union, Russia was lived from this region, and I think Mr. Putin decided to return this wonderful times when Russia and Soviet Union has a good position in the Middle East, and Syria and even regime of Bashar Assad, the main factor of this idea. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, then please.
Yeah, very briefly, two questions.
Yes, I am, because there are, I will take several questions at a time because I see there are several.
Very briefly, two questions to Vladimir. When you speak about division into 4 parts, what holds them together? Will be there, like in Bosnia, because they have an election, there'll be a presidency out of 4 regional presidents, or will there be a Syrian government or just a federation? So perhaps you can extend a bit on it. No, I think you collect. And I think it was Joost who mentioned about the intelligentsia outside, the refugees, but we heard about also the property law. Is the country, or will those who run the country or countries have an interest of bringing refugees back, when we have in Austria our own experience in the past after the Second World War? Because very often, you don't want refugees, especially the intelligentsia, back who has been outside. So the question is, how do you see that?
Walter?
Yeah. Thank you. Two very short points. I'd like to ask all of you to comment about it. The first one is the question of perceptions. As scholars, as there are no direct contacts, say, between Israel and Iran or between warring actors, there are no real good established formats of exchanging those. Therefore, what A does is interpreted in a total different way. Hosseinieh may be open in southern Lebanon, since you always have to assume the worst from your enemies or from your competitors, it's not such an innocent thing from an Israeli perspective, because you put it in a different framework. And this holds for all the others. And this is, I think, especially important if you try to rebuild, and this leads me to my second question, working relationships after whoever wins, most likely Assad, but among the Syrian communities. There's not only that the perceptions, they do this against my tribe, my people, my village or so, but there's also a legacy of violence between them. And my second question would be, how far do you think the identities are now so politicized that you cannot, because they have been always politicized for a way, that you cannot have, that they pose a serious threat to reconciliation and nation building or whatever.
So we take a third here, and then we, perhaps I add this other two, because I want to give all of you the...
Dr. Wilczek, I used to live in London for a while, and I was visiting always Royal Institute of Defence for different conferences. And once I met one young gentleman from Syria, and since I'm involved with international strategy for peace, I want to promote new vision to create new international organizations such which can give a peace guarantee. We have decided to meet each other in Claridge's hotel and discuss. And he asked me if he can come with his father and his brothers. I've told yes. And his father was brother of Assad's father. And
again, his father was brother of Assad's
father. So he's Assad's uncle.
Okay.
Yeah. Rafat.
Okay, Rifat.
Rifat.
Rifat. Okay.
And all the problems started that he was very angry. Then when his brother passed away, he was not elected president, only his son. Mm-hmm. And he undermined all society and paid mercenary. And that's a tragedy now. But I think young
we are going back in history, and this is
but it's, really you need to understand, because the consequences you can change when you understand why. And then I wish them peace from all my heart. And young generation like to have Assad. That's what.
Okay. So we have two questions here. One back here. Yeah. Oh. Yes, okay.
Yeah, mine is, I think, in addition, on top of Mr. Posch's point, I've been thinking a lot. I'm not an expert on World War II, but obviously Europe was able to survive thanks in large part to the New Deal and the ability to reconcile. What is missing? Do you think that that would be possible for the Middle East, particularly countries of Syria and Iraq? Or is there something missing that we cannot see these countries moving forward like Europe was able to move forward?
Very interesting question. Please here. And then there was another one, and then we stop there. I'm sorry. And we see if there is a second round. Please, yeah.
My question is to Ellen. You said that the main U.S. policy in Syria is not a CT policy, but rather it aims to put pressure on both Russia and Syria to kick Iran out. But more comprehensively, also referring to what Soli was talking about, how does the U.S. see the Iranian role in the reconstruction of Syria? Is there an American strategy to tackle the Iranian role in reconstructing the country? And if we look more deeper, the Iranian economic role in the region, it begins from Iraq. And now with Iran under more pressure, you have the Iraqi paramilitary forces immersing themselves more in the economic sphere in the country. So is there a comprehensive American approach towards the Iranian economic participation in both countries? Thank you.
And please, the gentleman here. And then we...
My name is Michael Laipson. I totally agree with Soli's point on the what you called Shiaization in Syria, and I'm quite surprised, Joost, that you are saying that this theory is more or less a little bit exaggerating. A lot exaggerated. My question to Soli is, taking, for example, the agreement of the 4 cities back in 2016 in the region of Zabadani, where more than 20,000 people had to leave the region so that Hezbollah and Shia fighters could enter this region in the south of Syria. Is this more or less a religious or a confession, let's say, strategy by Iran? Or is it more politically motivated? Because especially with the agreement of the 4 cities, Qatar played a vital role in paying Hezbollah about $15 million so that they can realize this ethnic cleansing there. So is it more a religious point of view, or is it more also politically motivated? Thank you.
Okay, this time we start with Ellen and Nicola, because you did not have a second chance, and then we... Okay. Please.
All right, so let me try to answer the reconstruction question. I really don't think the U.S. has thought a lot about who's going to pay for the reconstruction of Syria other than it shouldn't be the United States, okay? I mean, I think their view is wealthy Gulf Arabs, businessmen. Some Syrians say there's enormous wealth in the diaspora community that Syrians want to rebuild Syria. So I'm saying that half facetiously. My understanding is that, the Trump administration looks at Iran as a threat in a very comprehensive way, and so they would see Iran's economic penetration of a country as part of the problem. But in reality, I think Trump would declare victory if he got Iran out of military and paramilitary activities in key countries, and he probably wouldn't fuss as much about whether Iran was an economic partner of some countries in the region if they were not doing the other stuff. But again, I think that the administration has signaled a bit that it does not consider it to be a core American responsibility to rebuild Syria when the fighting stops. But I also wanted to just pick up very briefly on 2 of the other questions. On Europe, I think the logic of the reconstruction of Europe was to create economic interdependence. And what we know about the Arab world, in spite of the unifying efforts of language, religion, culture, is that it's the least integrated and least prone to economic integration region in the world. They just don't want to trade with each other. So that whole notion of joint Franco-German factories producing steel and coal, etc. That was the logic of how post-war Europe got back on its feet and reduced prospects for conflict. But in the Middle East, we're not really talking about interstate Arab-to-Arab conflict anymore. We're talking about crises of legitimacy within states. And so I think the analogy doesn't get us far enough, is I guess my main view. And on the identity question, I think we should remember that Syria used to pride itself on being a multi-ethnic country. That was part of their brand. We're secular, we're cosmopolitan, people of different sex and perspectives live together and work together. It will take a generation for people to recapture that belief. The same problem in Iraq, of how do you get back to a positive view of your multicultural identity. Yeah.
Nicola.
Just a very quick comment to...
No, take your time.
No, it's...
Not too quick, please.
I mean... In terms of perception, what Walter said, I think it's extremely interesting. The perception and the narrative on the ground. I think that one of the biggest issues in the Syrian conflict is that since the beginning there was a delegitimization of certain narratives. So we have simply refused to accept certain positions, and in particular, in the first part of the crisis, the Iranian one was systematically denied from, in general terms, in terms of participation to the negotiations. I'm not saying that the Iranians are, the Iranian narrative is the right one. What I mean is how much we have empowered the Iranians through this approach which is looking at Iran always under, let's say, looking at the country always with under the lens of an irrational actor willing to storm the region. There is a narrative also on that side. There is a reason, wrong, right, I'm not entering into this debate, for entering into this conflict from that part. And the refusal of this narrative at the beginning, in my opinion, dramatically increased the role of the Iranians on the ground, the role of the Iranian in escalating the conflict, and at the end, obtaining the results that we have today, where whatever could be the position of those involved, they cannot ignore Iran now. So if the target was minimizing the role of Iran in the region, well, the result is that Iran has been empowered. I fully agree with Joost when he said that the Syrians are not happy with this. The Syrians are not satisfied with this. And but this is the reality in the ground. And until the war will be active, in the sense that until there will be fighting operations on the ground, these will be the dominating force. So if we're not looking at the Syrian crisis from a perspective which is including all the regional actors in a proper consideration, I think it will be extremely difficult to consider a potential solution or let's say identifying a line of dialogue which could help Syria maintain its borders, maintain its integrity, and so on and so forth. And the perceptions, I mean, the Iranian perception, I think, is the most evident, but it's not the only one in terms of having been ignored or under-evaluated or simply denied it in terms of legitimacy. We can put several other elements among the actors which are active on the ground, and starting from the Kurds. And I think that there have been a misinterpretation or a refusal to understand certain position. This is the result. So now we have to cope with the result. And the results are not certainly the one most of those living in the area or in the international community were expecting. But this is what we have to deal with in Syria at the moment and in the foreseeable future.
Don't forget the
Microphone.
Yes, sorry. First of all, I would start with Walter's remark. Well, perceptions or non-communications. I think, of course, there is no connection between Israelis and the Iranians. Two of the most, I would say, anti each other in the region, at least. I think here, I think Russia wants to fill the vacuum, and Russia wants to be the mediator between all these, the go-between, and in this way to empower itself beyond the fact that it's the, as we say in the soccer terminology, it's the manager of the group, of the soccer team. It's not the trainer. Maybe Iran is one of the people who train the players, but the manager is surely Russia. So probably that's the way that the Russians are playing with this. Again, I'm coming back to this Shiaization. I didn't say this is a huge thing. I said that this is one of the elements, one of the tactics of the Iranians. In the Deir ez-Zor area, it more or less got about 2,000 people converting officially to Shia. It doesn't mean that tomorrow they won't change. But the more massive approach is the settlement of Shiites, true Shiites, from elsewhere in the territories. And of course, we can see in...
Soli, do we have any estimation of numbers?
Well, they are talking about, this is a process, of course, but there is more or less, the estimates talk about 80,000 militias that they are not have been settled, but they are encouraged to settle. And of course, there are recruiting bureaus by not only Iranian, already by Shiite Iraqis, that they have opened the recruiting bureaus for the people of the area. And I said before that this could be a result of economic reason, of being unemployed and you want some income. The same as it happened with ISIS. Many people who joined ISIS, they joined it because they wanted money, and ISIS paid. So they joined as not only as fighters, as teachers, because the whole ISIL, or whatever they call the country of Iraq and Syria, had to be administered. So they needed people. So that's about that. And coming back to your question regarding whether it is political or religious, I think it both. I mean, the Iranians have a very global view, and their global view is that we are fighting for the mustaz'ifin, the weakest, against the mustakbirin, the tyrants. And this is a global message, the same like the Soviet Union. We are working for, for the proletariat against the capitalists. Yes, so they have a global vision, and they have also one vision for the Islamic world, which is we are the al-Quraya al-Islam, which means that we are the leading country of the Muslims. How you become a leading country? You have to take a process of trying to convince that your path is the right way. How you prove this? That by saying, okay, Israel the enemy, we are the most successful against the Israelis. And that's part of the anti-Israeli propaganda that they have. But this is not only propaganda. You know, once I discussed this with our colleagues on the van when we were coming. 2 months after JCPOA, Khamenei comes and say Israel would not remain in 25 years. What does it mean, Israel would not? How Israel is not going to remain? The only thing that I can take is nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon, it means that the whole deal had flaws because it didn't secure beyond the 10, 15 years. So we can say that is the best deal that there is. Maybe there was the best deal for the 10, 15 years, but it didn't have any program for after. And that's the holes that we are talking about. If the control of the sites is not that the IE person or representative says, I want to look at this, the Iranians will play with him, you know, for weeks and months, or they say, no, this is a military site, you cannot visit. So what kind of, I sat down with the person that was actually in charge of the, you know, one-to-one, the officials negotiation. I forgot his name, is something with Z. I remember some kind of a Jewish guy from the United States. And we discussed this issue, and there is a lot of flaws. Okay, it's better than the situation before, but it doesn't stop the missile technology. And we know that the Iranians work a lot on the missile technology, because why? If you are not, the 1991 Gulf War proved for them that missile technology and missile warfare might be the good thing to develop. You know that Iran is conventionally inferior in terms of conventional weaponry. Their weaponry is outdated. But they develop asymmetric warfare, in which I think they are considered to be a superpower, if not a regional power. And they have developed this, and we know who stands behind Hezbollah, who is behind Hashd al-Shab, or who stands before the Houthis and all those groups. But nobody, for the action of those proxies, nobody goes and attacks Iran, although we know that who stands behind it. So some kind of international or collective solution has to be found in order to stop this or try to neutralize this in a way. Because if it's continued, it will be bringing only more instability, more escalation everywhere. Look, the Israeli-Syrian border was the quietest border of Israel from 1974 till the civil war in 2000, for almost 40 years. The quietest. Terrorists that wanted to come from Syria into Israel, they would go either to Jordan or to Lebanon, just on the crossing of the border. I know this area because I would do ambush in my military service at that point. They would go through one of the doors because there is a crossing of 3 borders together. They would go either this way or the other way, just not to be blamed that the Assad regime has sent terrorists. So what was the reason? Israeli deterrence. So I'm saying that all these things together, put together, it's explosive. And it should take the international community a serious step to do something about it. Because otherwise, I don't think Russia alone can do it with all its influence.
So I cannot take questions anymore. Only Taha then. But yeah, of course. And then you continue.
Yes.
And then you conclude.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just intervention regarding the Turkish, not the position, but the Turkish one is, in a sense, a unique issue. Mm-hmm. Turkey has literally responsible, directly or indirectly, up to 7 million Syrians right now. 7, yes. Even you could make the number up. It depends on the fate of the deal, the YPG area between Damascus and them, Americans and Turkey. Idlib, Afrin, that area, plus the Kurds left that area and came into Turkey by late 2012. So we are literally responsible of administering 7 million Syrians. And this thing is evolving in a very interesting way. It is an issue, burden, opportunity, asset, all of them. But none of the other actors have such a responsibility. So that's why one day US administration saying we are quitting, exiting from Syria. For Iran, it's the main issue, how to deal with his proxies. For Israel, just making point operations. For Russia, if one day they wake up and say, okay, done, we don't want to be in Syria, they could do it. But not for the Turkey. So more than 3 million Syrians in Turkey and more than 4 million Syrians in Syria directly looking to Turkey on aid, economic help, even right now administration.
But
So
you're speaking about now. How do you see the future role? What does
I was
Turkey
just going
want
to
do?
say that
Okay.
it is getting more and more even worse. So more people are want to see part of that ecosystem. It's not because Turkey is doing wonderful things over there, but that's the only positive thing taking place on the ground, while terrible things are also taking place. And after this Idlib deal, even it created another confidence that if we somehow stick up with this ecosystem, that's the only way we can live here. Because the other option is bloodbath, massacres, and we don't know how it will continue. As you just said, and nobody is sure when it may start or not. It's a deal, temporary or permanent. So, but we, to solve these things, or at least, have some kind of a roadmap. Again, we are repeating a panel. The main issue is Syria, but we are not talking about Syria.
Yeah.
Unless we reach the point, a panel, an international conference, when the title is Syria, and we seriously talk about Syria with the real factual things, by the way, because too many exaggerations, provocations, hypothetical assumptions on identities, proxies, actors, what's happening over there. I hope we will reach that point, but as of right now, we are still in the same vicious cycle. Thank you.
Well, thank you for covering also Turkey. So, please.
Now I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree with your speech. With your speech, yes. About Iranian policy. Absolutely agree. About confederation or don't know the future of Syria. I think that confederation form it would be best for Syria, but now it's impossible because I don't see the really common for every actors here, common leader for confederation state. I don't see the common political power for leading this new state. Maybe in some years when situation will change, something will be, but not now.
So, Joost, you started it, you have to finish it. I'm very sorry that I could not take everybody, but with such a big panel, I think we needed more time here. So, please.
On the refugee question, so we have to be careful. It's not just the intelligentsia that's in exile, of course. It's a very diverse refugee population. And maybe that's some of the more educated ones managed to get to Europe. But even there, it's very diverse. But there are a lot of people in camps, or not in camps, out in different places in Jordan and Lebanon, and of course mostly in Turkey. So we'll have to see whether they can go back to Syria. I think what people are waiting for is some kind of situation in Syria that is secure and stable, where when they go back, they are not put in prison or put in the army and put in the front if there's still fighting going on. So, and there's no guarantee of that. I mean, even Jamal went to the Saudi consulate thinking he'd be safe in the consulate in Istanbul, and it turned out not to be true. Can you imagine a Syrian refugee going back to Syria and not, the regime has come back with amnesty? Well, there's a long history of false amnesties in Iraq in particular, but in other places. So why would you believe it? So I think refugees are not going to go back unless there's some international guarantees and some kind of political transition that secures the area and allows them to go back safely. And then, of course, has to be reconstruction, economic opportunity, and all of that, so that they can actually make a living. So I don't see that happening soon. And if history is a guide, then if we look at the Iraq case, after decades, Iraqi refugees, exiles went back and helped rebuilding Iraq, or helped sucking it dry, whichever way you want to look at it, because there were also people who took advantage, carpetbaggers as they call them, and I can say it now because he's dead. Ahmed Shalabi was one of the biggest ones. They came there to loot, basically, so there will be a mix. But if there's a future for Syria, absolutely, it's in the refugee community, and hopefully that they or their children, educated, will go back and contribute to that. On the Shia villages, I mean, in answer to your question, Iran made the deal because of confessional reasons, in my view. Iran likes to stand as the champion of oppressed Shia worldwide. And so the Shia villages in Syria were a clear case where Iran went in order to protect their own people, in its view, to stand up for Shia anywhere. But that's not the reason why they are in Syria. They're not because of Shia in Syria, because again, there are very few Shia in Syria. The Alawites clearly are not Shia. They don't self-define as Shia. They're only defined as Shia by Sunnis, maybe by Israelis, I don't know. But not by the Alawis themselves. They are not Shia. I mean, Shias who believe in reincarnation, who celebrate Christmas, please. They're not Shia.
They came out of Shia?
Yeah, whatever, but they're not Shia. Yeah, I came out of something too, but I'm not. It's.
They are political Shia.
No, they're not. They're really not. Ask them. Please ask them. Anyway,
actually the father.
But please, I mean, you've said many things, and you know, I don't know if we're all academics, but you know, you've polarized the situation quite a bit with your diatribes against Iran. I can agree with you on a lot of issues on Iran. It's not
That's
that.
your view.
But I mean, I haven't heard anything about what Israel has been doing, and I would love to hear it. So what has Israel been doing, including in the occupied territories? It's you know, these things are relevant because it's all linked now. There is no more separation in the Middle East. Everything is now, unfortunately, interlinked. And we cannot come up with solutions in one place without doing harm in other places as well. Finally, on the issue, but I'm happy to raise it because it's an important issue. It is still the core issue in the Middle East. The final thing is on the confederation question. I think in an ideal world, in the conflict in Syria, we would have come to some kind of decentralized state. In fact, we hope for that in Iraq, we hope for it in Libya and other places. But in Syria, it's too late for that. The Syrian regime has won, or is in the process of winning, and it's not going to allow any kind of decentralization. I wish it were otherwise, but it's the case. So in the future,
you don't think the Russians wanted?
And the Russians have said that they can envision some kind of arrangement for the Kurds. Autonomy, I don't think confederation. Confederation is a recipe for separation. So they would never do that. That's not in the Russian interest. A Russian interest may be to allow some autonomy for the Kurds, and I would hope that can be brought about. But otherwise, what about other Syrians who would like to have some self-rule? I don't see it, unfortunately.
So, well, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, you know that this was a public part of a big conference, which we are starting on Friday, and it lasts for 2 days, and you can imagine that there will be very good, also hot discussions. I thank you very much for your patience and very much my distinguished panel for the contributions. Of course, there is so much on the plate, no? It's hard to bring it all together from 5 distinguished speakers in one panel, but I think there is a lot of input and food for thought for all of us. Thank you. Thank you.